Those Who Remain is a recently released supernatural horror game in which you play Edward, a dude with an apparent drinking problem, although this never factors into anything, who gets a phone call one night from Diane. We never find out who she is, but based on the events of the game, I'm going to presume she's his mistress. But let's just ignore that for now, because it is almost completely irrelevant for the story. After you arrive at a motel where Diane wants to meet you, someone apparently steals your car and eventually crashes it into a pole, leaving you stranded. You must make your way to the nearby town of Dormont, all the while encouraged by a ghostly voice to stay in the light, and find out what happened to the town. The game is evidently fairly low budget and comes courtesy of Camel 101, an indie studio whose previous titles include Syndrome and Orcs? Whatever. Neither of which I've played. I picked up Those Who Remain after seeing a few interesting looking trailers and honestly feeling down to try another indie horror game after a few recent rough diamonds convinced me to give some more a shot. It was released a few days ago and at the moment it sits at about 67% mixed reviews on Steam, which is a perfectly accurate representation of the game's overall quality and enjoyability. The gameplay loop is simple. You run around a place, clicking on things, reading notes and listening to people until the game acknowledges that you have completed the required number of clicks to be allowed to progress. There are occasional puzzles to solve, some of which are stupidly simple but look way more complex on the surface, others of which are incredibly bizarre and arbitrary. It's rare that the puzzles actually feel like they fit naturally into the environment or the story. They seem not to factor into anything that's actually going on in the game. For example, one puzzle towards the 3/4 mark sees you having to change the number on a signpost based on the number of sides a shape on the platform beneath your feet has. Many of the puzzles are like this, random, unconnected events that have no bearing or relevance to the story and seem to serve only to extend the playtime. I'd have preferred it if the game simply didn't have any puzzles like this at all, and focused instead on the pure horror element, but we'll get to that. Aside from these strange out-of-place puzzles, you'll also sometimes be thrown in and out of another reality, which more often than not serves to highlight how you're meant to progress through a stage. This tends to come down to either hidden objects which don't appear in the quote-unquote real world, hidden pathways or ways around the enemies that we'll discuss in a minute as well, where you otherwise wouldn't be able to get around them. When you have more control over how and when you dive into this other world is considerably less stressful than the occasional times where you are being violently affected by it. There are certain sections of the game where reality shifts every few seconds, forcing you to, for example, make runs of faith across a normal path in the real world, where in the other world there's a giant pit, or running between pools of light to avoid being stabbed by your friendly neighbourhood shadow people. It works okay most of the time, but the timings for several of these sprints are often very close to the mark, and when it comes to crossing large chasms, there are nowhere near enough environmental markers in the real world to make it clear where you need to stand to avoid falling into a pit. There is also an incredibly irritating static burst that happens every time you shift between realities, and when this starts to happen every few seconds, that noise very quickly gets insufferable. Beyond the puzzles, the gameplay itself is otherwise fairly standard. There are no weapons, so you can't fight back at all, and only a brief moment where you have control of any kind of light source. Interactable objects in the environment are extremely context sensitive. You're encouraged to search the area you're in thoroughly to find notes, clues on how to progress and background info on characters, which are all generally well written and give a good insight into what happened to the town, and how each character reacted to a tragic event that took place. The problem with this is that not all the cupboards and drawers and boxes can actually be opened or picked up or interacted with at all, and it seems completely random which objects you can actually interact with. Some boxes can be thrown around where others can't, and there are only 2 instances in the entire game where throwing something is actually required to solve a puzzle, which is bizarre because this is definitely something that could have been implemented way more. The biggest problem with the gameplay is how limited the movement system is. You can walk, run and stand still and that's it. Which for a walking simulator is not unusual and normally not a problem, but this game has enemies that you can't fight whose detection of you is apparently based on their line of sight, as they are very clearly deaf as fuck. When I'm running away from enemies, I need to be able to hide or crouch in a dark corner or lean around corners to see where they are before I move on, but none of these things are possible. You can't crouch, you can't lean, you can't even jump for Christ's sake, and this is one of those games where there are inaccessible parts of the environment that clear after you complete a puzzle, but could have been bypassed entirely if you could jump, and I hate that. I hate that so much. It's lazy game design. With regards to the enemies, there are 4 types throughout the game. Shadow people, a big ugly boob monster with a pole in its shoulder, a giant Ouroboros looking thing which only appears in one part of the game, and a woman with a knife. They aren't really particularly scary. Much like Outlast, the enemies are far less intimidating after the first time you see them, and when all you're doing is running away from them, it gets frustrating fast. It's tough to appreciate these enemies and what they may or may not represent when you're just skating past them to get to the next objective because they're deaf as a post, and you can literally stand behind them singing country songs without recourse.
Hello? Anyone here?
The Boob Monster is the most common enemy, and it's abundantly clear that this was heavily inspired by Pyramid Head from Silent Hill 2, as she chases you relentlessly throughout the game. Incidentally, she's the only enemy I could never reliably get away from, where the other monsters would give up if you broke their line of sight. And she is there to represent a bad thing that happened in Edward's past. This bad thing is completely divorced from the story of the town of Dormont, and seems to be there to give Edward a token, horrible, tragic backstory. Which unfortunately means that it just apes Silent Hill 2 in more ways than one, and speaks to an unfortunate lack of creativity or half-decent writing in a game that's already riddled with problems. So, aside from the bland movement system, the dodgy puzzles, the obvious admiration of Silent Hill, and irritating reality shifting, is there actually anything good about the game? Yes. Kind of. Sort of. A little bit. First of all, the aforementioned shadow people. They are an unmoving cluster of shadowy humanoid shapes with glowing eyes who appear very early on and are surprisingly effective until they and the game itself start to wear out their welcome. They only appear in the dark, and getting too close will get you stabbed. Especially early on, being in tight quarters with them makes the already stark, bleak atmosphere incredibly effective, and their stillness is unsettling for a good while. I'd say that after they stopped being unsettling, since they show up so often, it would have been cool to see them moving around, perhaps stalking you from a distance, getting right up in your face without actually breaking through the light and that sort of thing. It would have given them more of a dynamic feel and kept them fresh and interesting in a way that definitely would have improved the overall atmosphere. That said, as the game goes on, the logic to where they can and can't stand does seem to waver quite a bit, with them being very, very close to some pools of light whilst not appearing at all in other areas that are clearly dark enough. Secondly, the game's atmosphere itself is pretty good. It looks really nice, and it's clear a lot of work went into ensuring that the lighting system was as good as it could be given the likely low budget. There is a very odd filter over a lot of the backgrounds that can be a tiny bit distracting, and sometimes god rays and fog will illuminate the inside of a wall, which is weird. But otherwise the environments are quite nice and detailed, well lived in, and the lighting usually emphasises the dark, dingy misery of a town trapped in perpetual torment. It's definitely not original though. It uses light the way that Silent Hill uses fog, but as a budget horror experience it isn't half bad at all. It's a shame that the character models are terrifying and very strangely proportioned. Like, this guy looks like the bastard offspring of the Right Said Fred brothers, but I can take or leave this given how it's pretty obvious that the heart of the game is not in its characters. On a similar note, a few last things before I wrap this up that I liked or that bothered me. Edward's voice acting is by far the best in the game, as everyone else sounds like they had very minimal direction or context for how they were supposed to act. The background plot to the town of Dormont is far more interesting than Edward's backstory, and the game would have been much better if it focused on the town itself and stripped out anything to do with the tragedy in Edward's past, as it has no bearing on anything beyond the Silent Hill 2 aping that I mentioned earlier. The game also never actually explains who Diane is, and unless you get the bad ending, she is completely forgotten about for the huge majority of the runtime. And on the topic of endings, the good ending is ridiculously short, with no option to really see the ramifications of your actions, and so by extension is very dissatisfying. The bad ending confuses the entire narrative with a twist that's so out of the blue it is legitimately baffling. There are a lot of unanswered questions no matter which ending you get, which may or may not be a problem for you depending on how streamlined you like your narrative. The game also has an aggravating habit of dragging the camera away from you very suddenly to focus on something that was either extremely obviously the way forward, or a long speech made by a phantom of some kind, and in the case of the latter, the camera also has this uncomfortable habit of lingering on them long after they've finished talking. And lastly, the game's checkpoints are horrendous. Some of them are a few minutes apart, and others will see you replaying very tedious, very tiresome sections of the game that involve walking, stopping to listen to someone talking, walking some more, and then repeating the cycle. This gets particularly irritating when you realise that you cannot skip dialogue. Overall, Those Who Remain is an interesting but heavily flawed little indie horror game with a lot of promise, though it ultimately fails to live up to the potential that it does have. It's fairly short, around 3 to 4 hours depending on how much you explore, but it is also quite cheap. Clocking in at £16 at the moment, and with a 10% launch week discount, it's currently at £14.39. I would cautiously recommend it if you can pick it up in a sale, as it does have a lot of merit to its appearance and the background to the town of Dormont is fairly interesting, with a good deal of flair to its characters and the consequences of their actions, even if it doesn't build upon them as much as I would have liked it to. I enjoyed it more when I was able to freely wander and soak in the atmosphere, reading about the townsfolk and what caused the mess in the first place. That said, I could have done without the almost English accent man and his stupid mask trying to convince me to kill random people. Go away, dude. So yeah, worth a play, but just be aware going into the game that it has a lot of problems, and depending on your level of patience, it may not be worth the cost of admission. Otherwise, I'll pop a link in the description to a full playthrough by DanQ8000 for commentary, and a playlist of the game by Noxen for no commentary. Have a good one, guys. Stay safe.